Good morning. Clearly I just woke up. Alright, so previous videos I decided to talk about the Emperion series, Fourth Wing, Iron Flame, and Onyx Storm. So I figured today I'd try to do a bit more of an in-depth review, kind of get into the nitty-gritties about this series and what it's about, and really get into the reasons why I like it or not kind of thing. With that in mind, there's going to be spoilers. We'll take it in order. First book that came out is Fourth Wing.
What are you doing here? I thought I killed you yesterday, grumbled Albie quite racistly.
Fourth Wing. So clearly this is the one that kind of started the whole thing. This is the one that got super popular. This is the one that got book talk and booktube all in a huffle and a kerfuffle kind of thing, and got a lot of attention and therefore a lot of discourse on whether or not it's a good series or not. What actually happens in it? The story is told through the main character of Violet. Violet lives in a world where everyone, once they get to age 20-ish kind of thing, are designated to go to war college and support a war effort for their nation. Violet was originally going to go to this war college, which is split into kind of 4 segments. Violet originally was going to go into the kind of nerd segment, the kind of academics, if you will, but her mother, who happens to be the general / principal of this war college, says, nope, you're going to be going into essentially fantasy Air Force. You're going to learn how to ride dragons kind of thing. This is a problem because not only has Violet not trained for dragon riding portion college her entire life, but she's also got the physical disability where it stops her from being able to essentially go through college very safely. She breaks her bones very easily, she tears ligaments very easily, so she's just biologically, it's understood that she's not well designed for this war college. When she's there, romantically, she meets Xaden, and he's clearly the love interest. But Xaden's part of this, sub-faction of the nation that had a rebellion very violently quelled earlier, and they're all kind of forced into the war college. So him and all his people don't really like Violet, and her mother especially. The Riders Quadrant, the Dragon Riding Quadrant, is all kind of Hunger Gamesy, and no one really likes each other that much, so it's very difficult to make good friends. As it continues on, Violet uses her skills to kind of sneak through war college and as well of a way as she can, going through strategies like poisoning her opponents when they have sparring sessions so that they can't fight as well, having to constantly outthink the other riders so that she can get above them in certain situations that she usually wouldn't. And so she's kind of cleverly finding her way through all these situations despite being the clear underdog in the whole quadrant. This all changes when they get to where they have dragons essentially choose their riders kind of thing. And this all changes because Violet is in the unique situation where she has 2 dragons that decide, yeah, we're going to team up with Violet, which hasn't happened before and is all very unique. One of them is a very large, basically the most powerful dragon out there, and then the other one is like a small little baby, which is very strange. They're not supposed to get in there. And after this, it's basically a process of Violet figuring out how skilled she is, how high her potential actually is. All the while, throughout the entire portion, kind of learning more about like a conflict that the governing body / leadership of the cadets aren't telling the cadets or any of the frontline troops. Throughout the midst of all this, Violet and Xaden, they're establishing a relationship, they're getting to know each other kind of thing, and Violet's becoming much clearer about who she needs to trust or not throughout her time at school. And this all eventually comes to a head at the end of Violet's first year, where they essentially have a war games kind of thing, but the war games go wrong and she winds up fighting against the kind of secret war that the leadership was trying to keep hidden, which is against wyverns and their kind of riding sub-race thing known as the Venom. not very well known, and they don't seem to have very many weaknesses. So eventually Violet and her small team of friends, they survive a venom attack, and in the process they wind up learning about a rebellion that's brewing and who's all involved with it, which includes Xaden, which include all of Xaden's people, and which includes other people that she wasn't expecting. The other nations' people that they thought were enemies, but turned out they had this common enemy of the venom, as well as people like her brother, who she thought was dead the whole time. This book kind of follows that general plot line. What do I think about this book? It kind of reads like a weird freak combination of Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, Top Gun, and Game of Thrones all put together in like a weird mishmash. But what's really impressive is that Fourth Wing, I personally found when reading this, the Fourth Ring actually does this combination quite well. It's actually quite entertaining and fun, and it gave me like a lot of questions about the world building and what's all going on around the world. This was an easy read, a very easy read, very easy page turner. There was no real slumps that I found when I was reading it. It was easy to read, which for me is a good indication. If something is tough to read, it's harder to get through the pages, right? But this one was very easy to read. I read this in, I want to say like 4 or 5 days kind of thing, which is pretty good for me. World building, I think, is where it really shines. That being said, it is quite indicative of a lot of other series. I don't think you can say that the world building is particularly unique. It kind of takes a whole bunch of ideas from other series and just kind of, tags them all together in a decent way. The events surrounding the kind of portion of the story, the window of the story that we're looking at, that's where there's a lot of questions and intrigue going on. And I think that this book really shines in not answering those questions right away. Genuinely, I kind of feel that this is similar to the first Game of Thrones book, where a lot of the events that happen in Game of Thrones kind of just results of events that happen in the past. And as you continue reading Game of Thrones, and the show does this to a certain extent as well, it shows you what those past events were and just how much they changed things for the storyline that you're viewing in that window. The one main exception to the world building, I would say, is the magic system. The magic system is weird. Basically, what happens is the riders, when they pair up with dragons, eventually they wind up developing powers from the dragons. And basically, in Fourth Wing, it's at its simplest, which I think is at its strongest. That being said, it does feel... well, it's heavily flawed. It kind of feels like a selection of plot conveniences in order to just force the plot to move forward. Again, in Fourth Wing, this isn't so much of a problem, but this will become a problem later on in the series. I think at this point it's kind of interesting, and I think with the magic system, it just feels kind of tagged on. It doesn't really feel like a part of this world. It feels almost like if you took like My Hero Academia powers and kind of shoved them, force-fed them into this world building. It doesn't feel like the magic system matches the world in any kind of capacity. It's very strange. When it comes to characters and the character work, Violet and Xaden, because most of the story is done through Violet's lens and Xaden is the main love interest, they're definitely a highlight early on. I think it's very clear what Violet is thinking, her priorities, and what troubles her, what worries her, especially with her, I think the disability is called EDS. She's constantly worried about that in this book, and that's good. A person with the EDS, it makes sense that they'd be very worried in a war/fighting college. So I think that's actually very well done. The secondary characters in comparison tend to be very tiered. There are some that are really good or interesting. I would think the example, the command at Vezgaiath, they seem to have a lot of depth. There's a lot of like background stuff going on with them that is very interesting. But then there's a good chunk of characters that just kind of feel like named background characters that really don't matter all that much, or just don't really have much of a personality that's very well developed. And if I'm honest, with some of these characters, this seems to be a trend going throughout the book series. I know a lot of people are very easily capable of identifying which secondary character is which, but I found them kind of melding together in like a I don't know who's who point anymore. The secondary characters are very tiered, I think, and that can be a problem. Not a huge problem, but definitely can be. When it comes to the plot, I would argue that the plot in this book is primarily about discovering the secret war that the command is trying to hide. In this sense, it's kind of oversimplified, which when you consider the thickness of this book, it's not skinny by any means. I think for a discovering the secret war that's actually going on plot, it's a bit simplified of this version, and it feels like, considering that it does kind of have this cool Cold War kind of feel to it, it feels like it's missing a lot of the spying and that a lot of the espionage that should be involved in this kind of storyline just was forgotten or isn't included. Now, for the perspective of the characters, who's mainly like you're going under military training basically, that kind of makes sense, but it seems strange to have this kind of story with this kind of perspective character mixed together, and I think that that's a notable problem. The significant second story, arguably the first story, is the love story, which is very typical of romantasy types, and the story between Violet and Xaden going on here. With Fourth Wing, it focuses mainly on the kind of initial attraction, and in this capacity, it's not so much a love story in this book, it's more of a attraction story, and or just perfectly honest, just a being horny story. They're thinking about each other and what they can do with their bodies a lot, as opposed to like actually developing a strong relationship. It's mostly because in the vein of Xaden's people really doesn't like Violet and her family very much. It's more of a vein of, can I trust this person wholesale anyway? And at the end of the book, that question becomes much more interesting, I suppose. But ultimately, calling this book specifically a love story at this point is a bit silly and a bit rushed, I think. General themes and messaging with this book, I would argue that Fourth Wing is ultimately a book about finding strength in some unlikely places, as shown mainly by Violet. She can thrive in situations that she's not well prepared for, and she does so by necessity, but also by thinking outside of the box. In that capacity, it feels a lot like something like Mulan, or something like Ranking of Kings, where people underestimate her, but she's able to rise to the occasion by not thinking the way that everybody else does. They come up with creative solutions, they think outside of the box. With all that being said, it's not the best example of this specific theme. That being said, it's also far from the worst I've seen of this theme, so yeah, I think that theme is actually communicated quite well in Fourth Wing, and yeah, I have very little quarrels with that. Fourth Wing, for the perspective of the whole series, as the first of currently 3 books, but will ultimately be 5 books, I would say as an introduction to this series, Fourth Wing actually does quite a lot right. I think when we're talking about the discourse that surrounds the Emperion series, and mostly around Fourth Wing, I think the question comes up, does Fourth Wing match the hype that it wound up getting? I would argue probably no. But that being said, it also doesn't really need to match the hype. It's fun, it's decent, it's good, it's far from a masterpiece, but it's also not worth dissing to the extent that it is getting dissed, I find. So honestly, is Fourth Wing decent? I'd say yes, at the very least. If anything, I give it like a solid 8 out of 10 after a couple months post reading it, and yeah, 8 out of 10. It's solid. It's not perfect, but it's quite solid. I think that it's worth continuing after this one. Yeah, so that's Fourth Wing there. Well, hello, and welcome to my Not the Kitchen. Just got back from doing a whole bunch of errands around town, and I feel like I'm gonna need a nap real soon, but I figured that I would do the next portion of the Emperion series review here. And since I'm pretty soon to getting ready for a nap here, let's talk about the snooze fest of the Emperion series, Iron Flame.
Now here's the critical part.
It's so boring!
How does that work? What is that?
Iron Flame, fix that, there we go. Iron Flame. This one kind of goes with the kind of problems that tend to plague fantasy series, which is it's a very underwhelming sequel for a lot of people. If you're a huge fan of the series, then it's fine, but for most people, it is quite underwhelming, and I'm definitely in that camp. What happens in Iron Flame? Well, at the end of Fourth Wing, Violet learns of this rebellion, this underground war that's going on in the land, and, all of a sudden she's having this rude awakening of a whole bunch of secrets that was kept hidden from her, all of a sudden to come to light, and now she needs to deal with that. At the beginning, probably third/half of this book, a lot of that comes into conflict with Zane, because Zane is an active part in a lot of these secrets, and he's not willing to tell her everything that he knows because he needs to protect his people, and he just doesn't know if he can trust her yet. That being said, they do wind up going back to the War College. Zane's graduated, and they have this weird kind of separation thing going on with their dragons because their dragons are mates and they can't stay away from each other for too long. Violet's kind of going through this life in War College while knowing that there's a way more serious war going on that everyone's trying to keep secret and kind of hating it. At a certain point in this book, the secrets kind of forcibly come out. They can't hide the fact that Venom and the Wyverns exist anymore, and all of a sudden everybody has an ultimatum, and there's a weird split in the War College between dragon riders who side with the rebellion, like Violet and most of her friends, and then everybody else who is not necessarily an enemy, but is definitely not on their side for whatever reason. They don't believe in the big background fight. All of this gets into a head where the rebellion side, they need to figure out the next plan of attack. While they're figuring that out, it winds up becoming that they get attacked instead by the Venom. There's a huge worry that the warding system that their nation has is going to go down, which is the only real active defense that they have against the Venom. Ultimately, it winds up showing up that Violet's little itty-bitty baby dragon winds up becoming a teenager in the process of this book, and turns out her specific dragon race has a very unique flame breathing ability that can kill Venom, because most other flame doesn't kill Venom for whatever reason. And along with that, they find a way of repowering up wards that had been powered up in the past, but they couldn't remember how, just like lost in history kind of thing. But in the process of having all the dragons present to breathe fire against the ward battery system, they find out that a 7th dragon was necessary, and that happens to be that baby dragon that Violet wound up pairing up with. But in the process, the War College gets attacked. It turns out that's the most important place out of the whole world for these wards, and in the process of needing to defend the War College, Xaden kind of falls into using Venom power, and therefore becomes partly Venom himself. And that's basically the end of the book. We find out that Xaden is part Venom, and that's it. That's the end of the book. Iron Flame is weird. It really just is. There's technically a lot that happens in Iron Flame, and you can see how thick the book is itself. This one's thicker than the other two even. There is technically a lot that happens here. But when you're reading it, it never feels like much is really happening. There never feels as if there's much of consequence going on with each page as you're turning it. So it kind of gives you a odd sense of, oh yeah, something's going on. I personally found Wheel of Time to be a very similar reading experience where you're kind of just along for the ride, and yeah, things are happening, but it never feels like things are happening. And this one it's a much blander read, which is strange because the Venom are showing up, they're becoming a much more active, a much more present threat. They never feel very present, they almost feel a bit too distant of a threat. It makes it much more difficult for me to get excited reading this book. I'm surprised at the amount of time in this book, considering how we now know it's confirmed that, the war front, that secret war front is so important. I'm amazed that we spend as much time at the Hogwarts equivalent in this book as we do. It just makes the classes seem very much unnecessary or so small of importance that it's like, why are we here, right? So it really just felt very strange. It's not really a significant character arc change for the major characters. Realistically, they end up finishing the book kind of in a similar spot that It felt like Fourth Wing finished them, and they just don't really see too much of a major arc going on there. Getting more into specifics for the setting / world building. So a lot of the questions that Fourth Wing proposes with its world building, Iron Flame does answer. I don't know, it feels as if the answers that were given were very minimal. Along with it, there's not too much more new world building wise introduced in Iron Flame, and because of the answers that we get from the questions in Fourth Wing, the way that they're answered in Iron Flame, what Fourth Wing proposed as being a very dense set of world building winds up feeling very shallow. So the world building in Iron Flame is not nearly so much of a standout as it was in Fourth Wing, where it was, I thought, genuinely quite solid. The magic system, it remains unnecessarily complex, it remains unnecessarily simple. The powers, again, they feel so estranged from the world building and just, I don't know, so forced in to this world that it just feels very out of place for me. It's not developed in a way that makes me think, oh, there's something interesting going on here. It's just powers, and it's just forced into this world. And again, it doesn't really fit, I think. In terms of characters, we can kind of split this into Violet and Xaden, and then everybody else. And Violet and Xaden in this book, considering that they spend half of the book arguing with each other about healthy communication, it's not very believable since it hinges on Xaden keeping secrets that Violet feels she deserves to know, but I found that the secrets that he keeps are so wildly predictable that it didn't feel like that those secrets needed to be kept anyway. I just found that this whole conflict was just kind of rooted in nothing, really. When it comes to the secondary characters, there's a couple of new secondary characters that actually had a lot of hope. The prince of the nation that they're all in, he shows up. He kind of like runs away from the royal court in order to join the riders. We know that he's not like his brothers, and that his brothers seem to be largely kind of prickish. So he's actually interesting. I think his name is Eric. Not totally sure. Aaric. Most of the secondary characters, they almost feel missing. They almost feel like they take like such a distant back seat that like I wind up thinking to myself, well, what's actually going on? I know some of them were promoted to leadership, but who cares? Other secondary characters that could have been more interesting, they just weren't all there. So there's a couple interesting secondary characters that were introduced, but honestly, the secondary characters were quite lacking in this as well, I found. The plot, ultimately this story, the plot is whether or not you let people know what's going on, even if letting people know what's going on is gonna be a detriment in some capacity. Do people deserve to know everything that's happening? Even if they do, it might not be in your best interest. And the execution of this plot, I thought, was quite awkward. It stumbled. It really, I don't know. It feels as if when you're thinking about the plot in terms of are they worth keeping secrets, again, it kind of points back to that Violet Xaden thing, which comes up a lot in this series, of course. Someone farted. If your plot hinges on letting people know secrets, it kind of requires that those secrets that need to be hidden be of such huge, magnanimous proportions that it almost feels insane to keep them. But at the same time, the secrets that we do know that Violet is keeping away from her friends at the request of the rebellion that she's willing to take part in, those secrets that she's hiding, they feel so obvious from the perspective characters that it's like, why would you try to keep them secret anyway? There just doesn't seem to be much of a well-justified point in keeping these secrets hidden. So I honestly found that plot line, it could have been much better executed than it was. There's a kind of will they, won't they actually get together thing going on with Violet and Xaden again in the first solid half of the book that really overshadowed that keeping secrets plot line. And that one, I don't know, that whole will they, won't they kind of plot line that's super common with fantasy and romance in particular, it just feels a bit shallow. It feels a bit, I don't know, silly and ridiculous. So it wound up being very unbelievable for me. The romance storyline, it felt redundant. It felt like everything kind of started at square one again between Violet and Xaden. Now, there is technically some development. There in the process of this book there, once they actually decide to trust each other in some vague capacity, it moves from being just an initial attraction storyline to being how do we communicate somewhat effectively as people that are mutually exclusive in this kind of relationship. So there's some technical moving forward, but it doesn't ever feel like there's much moving forward, because at the end of Fourth Wing, you could have believed that they were going to be mutually exclusive anyway, and now they were separated again, and now they're back together again. It's like, okay, what's going on here, right? The end twist with Zane becoming Venom, I feel like should have hit harder than it did. In this portion of the series, we know so little about Venom and how their powers work and how they interact with the world that it just doesn't really feel like it hits very hard. It's just kind of like, oh, we could put a label on him and that's supposed to be scary. But at this point in the series, we don't know what that actually means. That's developed further in Onyx Storm, but at this point, it's like, okay, so what? The weight of the twist at the end there with Zane becoming Venom, it feels missing. It just feels very lacking. When it comes to themes and messaging, again, it kind of feels missing. It's about whether it's right to keep secrets, about whether or not we need to be entirely open with communication and, on the relationship front, on the are you clear with communicating with your friends front, are you clear with communicating your intentions to everybody else kind of thing, right? But it just doesn't really feel like it hits very well. And again, I think it's the nature of the secrets that they need to keep and why they're secrets to begin with anyway. And that's all up in the air, up in realm of questions, right? And it feels like a back burner. It feels left undeveloped or progressed so unbelievably that the importance of this thing was never communicated well. And a lot of this, I think, has to deal with the Violet, Zayden, will they get together or won't they kind of thing. And I feel as if that overshadows so much of what this book could have been that it really comes to a detriment. So Iron Flame, for the entire series so far, it's definitely the worst of the 3 books released. And at times, it's by a big amount, a very painful amount. But, sequels are hard. Sequels are stupidly hard, and this is undeniable. I think Iron Flame is the proof of this. But Iron Flame is an abnormal drop in quality for sequels, to an extent that this kind of felt very strange. It's almost like, at times it doesn't feel like it was written by the same author for me. It just doesn't feel like there's as much care with the world building going on. The character relationships, they're not nearly so strong here. Violet herself, her EDS takes a backstage in this book. It barely shows up in this book at all. It's almost as if Yaros just forgot that she had it, it felt like. I know that Yaros didn't forget that, but it never feels like it plays an important part in this story as it did with Fourth Wing, and that's, again, a real problem here. So this book honestly just feels like it was really, really hampered, almost done as a second thought, almost like it was rushed out, rather than a book that was properly developed. It felt like it was like in second to third draft stage, as opposed to a finished product to me. And because of that, if I was going to give Iron Flame a score, I'd wind up giving it anywhere between 4 and 5 out of 10. It's not so bad to me that I'm going to drop it forever. I mean, clearly, I finished all 3 of the books here. But it is such a significant drop in quality that it feels genuinely very strange. So, that's Iron Flame. And I'm gonna go take a nap now, because I need one. On to the last book of the Emperion series, which is Onyx Storm.
We're going on a trip in our favorite rocket ship, zooming through the sky, little lights on.
First things first, I think that this one by far and above has the best cover. Not usually a fan of these sprayed edges for a book, but I actually think it works out not too bad here. So, what happens in this final book of the Emperion series so far, the third of 5? Well, at the end of Iron Flame, Zayden turns into a Venom. It is no secret. He tells Violet right away. They need to figure this out. In this book, turning Venom is displayed as kind of being like an addiction to like being hooked on a very hard drug, and it's seen as quite negative. Zayden needs to essentially fight the temptation to use more Venom power in order to solve his problems, as opposed to using regular power for whatever reason. That's not the only problem. The Venom attack is much more prominent, at least in story, and they are starting to get aware of which places that have these ward shielding batteries, which of these places are easiest and best to attack. And their attack is getting so wide that the warding is starting to fail, and they need to restart these wards. With that in mind, Violet's goal throughout this story is essentially to find the seventh dragon race. Her younger dragon is seventh dragon, but she's the only one that they know of. That being said, they think that there are more out there, so they feel the need to find them. This happens in multiple waves. The first wave is wildly unsuccessful because it was led by one of her professors, Professor Grady or something like that. It was led by her professor and was wildly unsuccessful, so eventually Violet kind of takes over ahead for discovering the seventh dragon race, and they eventually wind up kind of centering in on a series of kind of island nations that's slightly off the continent where magic doesn't exist, as compared to the rest of the continent where magic does exist. There's a assorted island to island hijinks that goes on, and eventually they do find the seventh dragon race, who is magic. Apparently that's why magic doesn't exist on these islands to begin with, but turns out they're kind of weird. They're like pacifists for whatever reason, and they're very concerned about the direction that the continent is taking their dragon kind, and they don't like where it's going. All of this winds up coming to a head at the end of the book, where there's a big battle. Zayden essentially loses his fight against not using Venom powers. He succumbs to that temptation, therefore becoming full Venom. And then there's like a big cliffhanger at the end of the book where Violet has had her memory erased from one of the other students, and the reason for that being that, well, it's implied that Zayden did something so bad that she requested that her memory be erased. So kind of a cliffhanger ending at the end of this book here. And considering that this is the last book, a lot of people are in a hefty debate on this one. So yeah, it's interesting. Notes. In terms of an overall review, Onyx Storm is probably the one where my mind has changed the most compared to when I first read it to what I'm feeling now, and it's been like a solid month, almost month and a half after I've read it now. In terms of overall, this book is definitely a step up from Iron Flame. That being said, that's not a big bar to cross. I think it's also fair to say this book has a wildly chaotic execution. It kind of feels like it's going absolutely everywhere at one point or another, so it's kind of hard to keep track of where all the different plot lines are going in this one. I would argue that Onyx Storm is kind of a tale of a first third and then the last 2/3. The first third is actually very strong. It's very good. I think there's an argument to say that it's actually the strongest portion of this whole series so far is in this first third. There's a lot of politics going on. There's negotiating. The threat of the Venom is much more real, much more present, very violent. There's a very gruesome fight scene at the very beginning of this book, and it's honestly some of the strongest writing there was wholesale. The last 2/3 of the book, this is where most of the chaos comes in, and it does kind of center around, traveling around, finding these dragons, and the island nations are a necessary addition to the world building. That being said, I find their execution very chaotic, and they need to be kind of tightened up, I guess, for the rest of the series, I think, if this is going to continue. They just felt very strange. The ending has a lot of debate around it about whether or not it's a good ending or not. I'm generally on the side that it's a good ending, mostly because I find it necessary for the book series as a whole. It adds a real sense of tension that was necessary, a real twist of the knife after it's been stabbed into your soul with the end of the book and what happens to Xaden and what's gonna be the case moving forward in this series. I think it was absolutely necessary because it stops the characters from feeling a bit too safe. And because of that, I actually think that the ending succeeded. That's my take. A lot of people would probably disagree with me on that one, but that's just what I think there. Setting / world building. So there are problems with the world building and the setting right now. The first one, we're going to go back to the islands. Each island is centered around one of the gods in this world, and they all worship one god on each island kind of thing. And at its core, this could be an interesting idea. I wound up leaving feeling it was very gimmicky. We don't spend very much time at each individual island, and the time that we do kind of gives a sense that each of these islands and their cultures are comically one note. So I thought that there was a real high potential to add some real depth to the world building, another extra wrench thrown into the world building to make it all interesting, and it just felt a bit too one note for me. The other aspect that I think is a weakness is Bezgaiath, that war college. It's very outgrown now, with the war arc essentially becoming much more present, much more real, much more violent. Everybody knows it's real, everybody knows how violent it is. Bezgaiath feels very out of place, and there's a good chunk of this book that remains just classroom and doing classroom stuff, and it just doesn't fit anymore. It's a similar feeling to in Harry Potter in the 7th book, where they needed to leave Hogwarts in order to go find the Deathly Hallows. It felt necessary for them to leave because the story had at this point outgrown Hogwarts and had expanded beyond it. It wasn't just Hogwarts problem, it was Wizarding World problem. The same thing is happening here, I think, where the conflict as a whole, it's far too wide to just encompass Bezgaiath. So the fact that we're spending so much time here is starting to be a bit silly. It's like Bezgaiath is like the shrimp in a very wide shark-infested ocean. My suggestions, honestly, I would say either the plot needs to leave Bezgaiath wholesale, which I think is what's going to happen, or honestly, I think Bezgaiath should honestly be destroyed. Add some real stakes to the story here. The wards at the end of this book, they're still not down. If you destroy Bezgaiath or take down the warding from Bezgaiath, that actually adds a very strong sense of tension to the overall story, which I think would help it a lot. I think the addition or the introduction of the 7th dragon race, it needs to be explored more. The fact that they're pacifists honestly just feels strange. I mean, dragons are very proud, they're very intelligent in this series, but I don't know. They were in the book for so briefly that I feel as if they're going to need further development in the next 2 books, because what we got so far just leaves them, honestly, at this point, feeling kind of unbelievable. I need to see what else is going on, what's behind the reason that they're pacifists. Otherwise, it feels like they're going to be a bit stuck. When it comes to characters, Violet and Xaden, they decided to be mutually exclusive in their relationship, and in this book, it turns much more into them needing to support each other, especially Violet needing to support Xaden while he's dealing with this kind of not quite drug, but very similar to drug temptation of using the venom power. And it was a very nice breath of fresh air where the story was, well, there's still horniness in this story, but it didn't feel like just horniness. It did feel like a continued establishment of that relationship and what's going on there. And it felt like a necessary breath of fresh air, so I was actually quite happy with it. The secondary characters that were introduced in Iron Flame, they do get some more time to shine here. I think the secondary characters in this book are actually quite good, especially that Prince Eric. He winds up being much more present, being much more aware of what's going on around him. He's certainly not a passive character in the series so far. So I think that it's fair to say that the secondary characters are quite a large improvement compared to the previous books. In this book, the plot in Onyx Storm is basically about Violet discovering her actual leadership qualities. Maybe not as a tactician in a military sense, but definitely in a wide scale kind of sense, especially in the form of that kind of, the reluctant leader kind of thing. She doesn't necessarily want to be a leader, but she's kind of being put in situations where her having leadership qualities definitely helps solve problems. This plot line, it does land. It does feel a bit forced at times, especially with someone like Violet, who is still kind of believing in her being meek and her being weaker than the others, even though with the actual events that's happening on the page, there's no reason to think that anymore. Again, her EDS does not really come into play in this book. That is a problem. But she's still in the belief that she's weak, that she's under everybody else, that she doesn't have as much of an effect, that she doesn't have as much of an effect on the world as she actually does. So it lands, but it's not a stick the landing. You know what I mean? The romance storyline, it does ultimately pair with the leadership storyline in a kind of cruel, poetic consequences, where the acceptance of the leadership that Violet needs to do at the end of this book, it comes with the sacrifice in the loss of her relationship with Xaden, or at least it feels that way. And the necessity for characters to sacrifice things in order to attain other things that they need, that shows up multiple times in this book. So it's an odd and interesting theme that carries over repeatedly. Onto the themes itself. The themes itself is interesting because the themes I found was very easily missable on the original read, but winds up becoming much more prominent post thought. Again, it's that thought of, sacrificing being necessary in order to attain your leadership, the call to accept leadership, the call to accept that you have responsibility for your actions and what you do on the world, and what you do will affect the world kind of thing. So I do think that the theme, it doesn't necessarily hit immediately while you're reading it, or at least it didn't for me, but post-review, I guess, it does actually hit pretty well. Onyx Storm, for the series as a whole, it does provide answers to questions that were proposed in Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, mostly Fourth Wing still. More questions are made for the future of the series, but it does so in a way that's particularly chaotic for the series as a whole. It's a decent place to end a book, but it feels like it stumbled. It feels like it didn't land the way that it needed to, and it's very unsettled in where it leaves the story at this point, and that's not really a compliment. It just feels very chaotic. I think this book, one thing that it did very well is it brought the very distant kind of Cold War-esque threat that didn't feel nearly as present in the first two books, and it, again, in the first third of this book, brought it much more to the forefront. It's a much more present threat, these Venom and their wyverns and the way that they're attacking everyone. Things do genuinely feel in the first third of this book to be under heavy stakes, and that's something that Onyx Storm does quite well. With that in mind, that threat is very much missing for the last 2/3 of the book. It kind of feels like Iron Flame for the last 2/3, where the threat is very distant, that the characters have a lot of time in order to solve this problem that they have with the Venom, that they can kind of solve it at their leisure and at their will, and it's very strange. Again, this book is real chaotic and wavy in terms of how it handles its conflicts. It's very strange. Overall score for this book, the front portion of it really does carry, and quite a lot. I really enjoyed the first third of this book, quite a good amount. So the overall score of this, I could see it being anywhere from a 6.5 to a 7.5. Again, the cover is very good, love the cover, but it's a very strange book. This is one of the strangest books I've read in a long time, and its place in the fantasy world, I think, is going to be up for debate for quite a while. It's certainly not the best in the series. Iron Flame is still the worst in the series by far, but I don't think Onyx Storm really is steady on its feet with the way that it does its world building and its plot progression for the series as a whole. So it's an odd place to kind of be stuck with the series at this point. So yeah, that's Onyx Storm.
Whose cuisine reigns supreme?
Well, it is the next day, and had to make dinner at some point, so I figured that might be a good idea to talk to you guys. I figured I'd take this time to talk about some general notes with Yaros's writing in the Emperion series as a whole. First thing, a kind of commonality across all of her books is her prose work. And why do I want to talk about her prose work? It's kind of a tale of two halves. I think Yaros's prose work is... It's definitely an accessible kind of prose work. It's very easy to get involved in the fantasy genre if you start out with Yaros's writing and her prose. It's not too flowery, it's not too excessive in terms of complicated vocabulary or anything like that. So it winds up becoming quite easily accessible. And I think that's genuinely a nice positive of her writing, because there's a lot of fantasy out there that's kind of stuck up in terms of the language that it uses, and honestly, it can frighten people away from wanting to read more fantasy. And Yaros is the opposite of that. Yaros's prose, because of how accessible it is, allows people to get into the fantasy genre, which I think is a positive overall. That being said, her prose is almost too accessible. There is no sense of place with her prose at all. Like this story, if you got rid of all of the fantasy elements, you get rid of all the dragons, you get rid of all the magic, and you kind of change the setting to being in the modern world, the prose wouldn't have to change at all. It's exactly applicable to language that we would see today, and I think that is ultimately a bit of a weakness, because prose can be used to help develop the world building of a place very easily, and in this case it just isn't. It's just kind of a medium for telling a story. That being said, it's not bad whatsoever, I think. Okay, we are talking about Rebecca Yarros, Fourth Wing, Iron Flame, Onyx Storm, and the Emperion series as a whole. What does that mean? We're gonna have to talk about sex. So, in my opinion, I think that the sex in this series is more than a bit excessive. And honestly, it doesn't feel like it fits into the world building and the story that's actually being told. If you're looking at it from a romance sense, I don't really find it helps out understanding the depth of the relationship between Violet and Xaden. And in terms of the wider overarching story of Violet, you know, discovering who she is as a leader and as a personality, and, you know, the power that she has in the world and everything that goes on there, then the sex just feels unnecessary. And to me at least, it winds up feeling almost kind of forced. This is especially a problem with Fourth Wing, where everything else about the book was so much fun, I found. There were a couple minor flaws, but it was fun overall. But all of a sudden, you just have a sex scene. And it's like, what the crap? And the sex scenes themselves, they're written very viscerally, in a sense of biological bits moving in, sliding for other biological bits, and that's just very strange. So I personally found the sex scenes in this book to be quite egregious, very out of place, and ultimately quite unnecessary. And that's not to say that you can't have, it's almost oxymoronic to say this, palatable sex scenes, as it were, in writing. It just didn't really happen here. I think that, honestly, you do the traditional fade to black, and I think that that would function well enough for the storytelling as a whole. So yeah, the sex just felt very out of place for this story so far, which is funny because of how much it is romantasy, and that's a common thing for romantasy, but yeah, it just felt very strange and out of place. Other notable things. I think I said this before, but it's worth repeating, honestly. Yaros is just really good at writing fight scenes. They're very easy to track, they're very visceral, they're violent in a way that most other fantasy books just really aren't, I think. Another notable thing, I think, is that Yaros's very sudden popularity, which I don't think she was expecting, and I don't think anybody was really expecting, it might legitimately be holding the series back as a whole. What do I mean by this? Well, when she wrote Fourth Wing, it got so much attention that she felt the need to be able to write Iron Flame very quickly. Iron Flame was released about a year later, which is very fast for writing a book as a whole. And then, between those two and the popularity that they were still getting through TikTok, BookTube, things like that, they felt the need to keep releasing their books. So again, only a year after Iron Flame, Onyx Storm was released. So in the span of 2 years, we wound up getting 3 books, which just feels very fast. And I think that this is indicative of the problems that we see with the sequels, Iron Flame and Onyx Storm, where they feel like they were written too fast, and thus the problems that they have, they're quite prominent and evident and hard to miss. So I think the popularity of this series might have legitimately contributed to a lot of the flaws that we saw with this series as a whole. With that being said, Yarros has explained through interviews and such things, so forth, that she wants to take a break and take a little bit longer to write her next book. And honestly, I think this is quite a good thing, quite a positive thing overall. It'll allow for a little bit more thought to go into the whole plot line and see where it all fits, make sure that things don't wind up getting put together in a bit of a clumsy way. So I think the fact that she's taken a break between releasing her next book and now, which is pretty shortly after Onyx Storm was released, I think that is a very positive thing. So I'm actually quite happy for that. That might be a way to rectify some of the issues that I have with the sequel books. I mean, we'll see, I guess, but yeah. I think that her taking more time to write the next book would ultimately be in her and everybody's benefit. Is the Emperion series indicative of the fantasy genre as a whole? I don't think so. It's more, I don't want to call it a forced combination of romance and fantasy, romantasy, naturally, but it does feel a bit forced. It feels like a weird kind of offshoot of fantasy rather than an indication of what fantasy is like in its totality. So it's not really an indication of romantasy as a whole, I don't. Last minute final thoughts before I leave you guys and make dinner here. I think everybody needs to calm down a little bit on this whole discussion. There's a lot of people that think that this series is the worst thing in the world, and I don't think that's true. And there's a lot of people that think that it's the absolute best thing in the world and that Yarros is a genius, and I think that's untrue as well. The series is best, I think, when you don't do what I did and think too much about it. The series is best when you turn your brain off and just let it entertain you. And I think that if more people started doing that, as opposed to overly criticizing it, then honestly, the series would probably wind up being a lot more enjoyable. So I think that's gonna be where I will leave you guys. Thank you for watching this strange video that took place over multiple recording sessions. I'm gonna make dinner, so thank you very much for watching. Have a good one.